Hello and welcome to T is for Text, Time, and Technique with Dr. Freddie Hiebert.
So as Tori said, I'm going to be talking about the role of text, time, and technique in relation to a specific set of texts, but the ideas here related to text, time, and technique generalize. And I'm also going to tell you where you can get some free downloadable texts at Text Project, which is the not-for-profit that I run, that have the same underlying intentions and design. So I want to start out. Today is kind of a propitious day because the results of the last National Assessment of Educational Progress were announced. And keep remembering the national, it's called the Nation's Report Card, takes a representative sample of kids from every state and establishes how 4th, 8th, and 12th graders are doing over a period of time. Before I get into those results, and I don't have the latest ones, those just came out this morning and they have not been shared yet, just the press announcements. But what I want to take a look at, when we originally initiated QuickReads, there was a lot of talk about oral reading rates. And keep remembering, oral reading rates are done on a very limited task. Kids aren't being asked to read for 2 or 3 minutes. It's typically 3 one-minute reads. But I find it profound that in the last decade, our students have actually gained in their oral reading rates. And that is a very difficult thing to pull off, especially on as large a scale as is the case. These are data from DIBELS. But as you see, once we get to 6th grade, we're kind of at the same point. By the way, this is the 50th percentile. But overall, till the 6th grade, it's an 8-word gain by the end of the year. That's phenomenal. And I'm not that worried about the point at the end of 6th grade, because it turns out that most young people, most adults, speak at about 150, 145 words a minute. So you usually wouldn't read, if you're reading expressively, much faster than you talk. Okay, so there's good news here about oral reading rates. That doesn't mean, I'm not going to suggest today that we don't continue to attend to the issues of rates. I'm particularly interested in the issue of rate with comprehension when kids are reading silently. That's a very important thing. But we've also got some more negative news, and one of them has to do with comprehension. So when students are asked to do retellings on DIBELS tasks, and I'm not endorsing that assessment, it just happens that they administer it to thousands of students and allow people like me to actually take a look at the information. But what you're seeing here is that in terms of retelling, even at the 75th percentile, we're not seeing very robust performances. And keep remembering, this is not a very rigorous assessment. It basically has to do with how many words you say. Some of them have to be some of the keywords, but it's not a highly impacted inferential comprehension task. But when we get to more robust comprehension tasks, as on the national assessment, what we see here is that we've got a sizable chunk of our students who are performing below basic, below the levels we'd want them to. Now, I want to point out that, and I've talked before about what the text difficulty is in these assessments. I find that it's very comparable to the DIBELS, and on the DIBELS we find that most students by 4th grade are getting about 95 to 96% accuracy. But when they're asked to read in an extended context, and that's what the NAEP is, you're asked to read text over about 600 to 700, 800 words at 4th grade, and then you answer questions. And that turns out to be a challenging task for our students. So what I want to suggest today is that we have the evidence to make a difference with this context. And what we have to think about is instruction that's intentional. We have to attend to the text. Just any text isn't going to do what you need. And I'm not suggesting we go back to very heavily scripted kinds of text like in the Dick and Jane era, but I am saying we have to think about the elements of text. We also have to think about how much time students are reading. And finally, we need to think about what is the instructional support or technique. That was the best picture that I could find for technique, a light bulb. Okay, so I'm looking at text. I went and found the text that was one of the ones I used as a teacher, teaching second grade in the early 1970s. Now, this is actually a pretty interesting text about teaching dolphins to talk, or actually recognizing the communication of systems of dolphins. And I went and I found the same second grade program, but in its 2017 edition. Now we have moved to authentic text, although I think that Dr. Lilly has some authenticity to it. Oops. But what you're seeing here is that there's a big difference when we look at the kinds of texts that are on the right-hand side relative to the left-hand side. And let me tell you what the difference is. First of all, you saw that here. There are fewer words, and this is all at the second grade level. I took all the words that the state of California gave me as a second grade teacher, and then I looked at all the words in all the different books, level books, anthology, any kind of supplemental. And what you're seeing is that there's a remarkable difference in the number of words. It actually turns out, I'm not just saying you need individual words, you need them to mean something. But the diet here is a very different one. I often talk about reading diets, and this is a very different reading diet. Another way in which the diet is different is that in 1971, the number of rare words per 100 at the second grade level was much less, almost half of what it is now. And even more significantly, there are more single appearing words. So one single appearing word per 100, or about 1.25, may not seem like a great deal. But what this means is every 100 words you're reading, there's a word that you have to figure out, but you're not going to see again in the entire program. And keep remembering, I'm talking about the approximately 45,000 words in the entire program. So what I'm suggesting here is we made some changes, ostensibly to get much more interesting texts, and some of them are and some of them aren't, and some of the old ones were and some of them weren't. But in so doing, we haven't attended to some things that we know make a big difference in becoming a proficient reader. One of those things being how much you get to see, how many rare words there are in the text. So every time you encounter a rare word, so what you're seeing here in 2017 is if you have about 7 rare words for every 100. A rare word simply means you haven't seen it a lot in text. That doesn't mean you might not know what it is. For example, a word like gorillas, a rare word, or bananas. It just means it's a word that you have to figure out that you haven't seen before in text. I was worried about this situation. And so what I did is I began looking at, could we have engaging texts that actually had a high level of word repetition in the bands of words that kids are needing to become good at. So it's not just any words at any particular point in time, but for example, there are certain words that are moderately rare that become more and more important as you move through the elementary grades. And I wanted to be sure kids were having opportunities with those. I want to emphasize here that I chose to stick with informational topics for a couple different reasons. One is that we know, and we've known for a long time, but the work of the Reading for Understanding grant has actually substantiated this finding. And that is that what I know influences how well I comprehend. And often as teachers, we've been front-loading text. But the deal is when kids are reading on their own, there's no one to front-load for them. We need to learn as readers. To be a good reader, you need to be able to use text to expand your background knowledge. Now, one of the things that I learned early on is that, in fact, kids told me this. They would say things about the Dick and Jane readers that those aren't real stories. And they weren't, because words were repeated so many times. You'll remember Dick and Jane kind of have a obsessive compulsive disorder, right? They jump, 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 or run, run, run. It turns out that in a good narrative, you know, a writer, like the one we see here, will use lots of different words for what Anna is doing. They won't use the same word all the time. So, but it turns out in informational text, if we're talking about how animals communicate, or about information that they communicate, or signals, the same words do make sense to be repeated. So for a variety of reasons, including that you need to develop background knowledge, and frequently the kids, I call them kids who depend on public schools to become highly literate, they often don't have the background knowledge that is assumed in different kinds of text, both stories and informational text. So what I did is I took a topic like animal communication, and I did it at about the same length that 3rd and 4th graders are evaluated on at the end of the year by state and national assessments. So what you're seeing here are texts of about 500 words. This is, again, I'm focusing on 2nd grade here today, but teachers can have students read these in chunks so that kids get better at reading independently. And then they can also read them as a set so that you begin to attend to the task that I've been suggesting is a real problem for the kids who are having difficulties, for those kids who are below basic on the national assessment. I'm saying a lot of them will read the first chunk, but they don't have capacity to keep reading. They don't have stamina. So one of the intents here is to develop background knowledge and stamina. So this gives you some idea of the single appearing, the rare words, and the single appearing words. So it's the green that's in QuickReads. And actually, in terms of single appearing words, I think in this entire unit of grade 2, there are maybe 1 or 2. One of them is the word high, and the other was the word scare, which I'm hoping kids can deal with. But what you're seeing is we substantially, in designing QuickReads, engaging important topics, but we've decreased the number of rare words, and when they appear, they're repeated. That's a really important concept. When a word like communicate appears, it's repeated. So let me tell you about the 3 dimensions of QuickReads. The most basic is the knowledge portion. A second is the vocabulary, and vocabulary connects very closely to knowledge, right? We use labels to words to label concepts. So these are 2 points that are very close together. And then we're also concerned with the rate at which kids are able to recognize words. If you recognize words very slowly, then it's going to take away from your ability to process what the vocabulary means and the knowledge you're building. And I want to be clear that when I'm talking about reading rate, I'm not talking about getting kids up to crazy levels. I'm not talking about them to be just decoding words fast. I never do nonsense word tests. I think that that's a very strange concept, especially for kids who depend on schools to become highly literate. But I'm concerned that kids are doing enough reading so they can read with sufficient rate that they can actually make meaning of the text. So let's look at knowledge. So in the QuickReads, what I did is I started with standards documents to see what was critical in science and social studies. I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting this is a replacement for a science program or for a social studies program, but I know that information about insects and rocks and weather also are really critical in the stories that kids read. These stories have context, they have problems. There even might be a problem that has something to do with a magnetic field, or something about ramps, that some character, something comes sliding back down. So I wanted to give kids some of the vocabulary and ideas, but I also wanted to be sure that we're giving kids opportunity to have exposure to these various ideas fairly early on with text that you can read on your own. And I don't mean on your own that the teacher isn't involved at all, but where the teacher isn't reading the text for you. We also looked at social studies standards and looked for ways in which we could take ideas related to, for example, civics, and make them interesting and palatable to young children. Turned out that I was gathering these topics just about the time of 9/11. And I became immersed in the idea of how are we teaching our students about living in communities and who we are as human beings and as Americans specifically. Okay, I want to point out that in terms of knowledge building, there are always comprehension questions, including ways in which you connect your knowledge across these texts, and also ways for you to do responding. So even with second graders, we're building up the stamina, the persistence, and the proficiencies that our states and our national organizations have identified as things that are critical. Now, this is my favorite part, and I do have to say that my colleagues who supported and are responsible for getting QuickReads out there were very, very generous with me, and one of the things I was adamant about is I do a lot of semantic mapping, and I believe semantic mapping is a critical way in which you keep notes to remember things you've learned. I think there's all too often when we don't review what kids have learned, when kids don't remember what they've learned. And this page where you get to write down your keywords, I think is a very, very important part of the whole project related to knowledge. Okay, in relation to vocabulary, some of you have heard me before, know that I've done a lot of work in identifying the words that most account for the words in written texts. So we've got 2,500 complex word families, and a word family is like the help family: helper, helpless, helping, also the inflected endings, but also words with prefixes, the prefixed and suffixed forms of the words. So these 2,500 words, by the way, these are from one of the state assessments at grade 3, and I just wanted to show you. Remember, we're going for 3 to 4 complex or rare words per 100, and that's about what these texts have. But what I'm showing you here is that consistently, the 2,500 families account for a majority of the words in text. And this is what these words look like. They are not simply the Dolch words. The Dolch words are a tiny little part of it. These are meaningful concepts that are really important to how I think about science, how I think about in terms of civilization, social studies, in terms of design, how we deal with STEM. These are, and keep remembering, each of these words represents a family of at least 5 different words. So what we're trying to do is immerse kids in this vocabulary. And what you're seeing here is that the levels of QuickReads, there are 6 levels, those levels emphasize these words in a staircase form. Okay, so what I'm saying is that at level B, which is roughly equivalent to second grade, what we're seeing there is that you're going to have lots of experience with the 600 most frequent word families, as well as words that have short, long, and R-controlled vowels. Okay, so each of the books, there are 3 books for every level, but each of these levels is going to emphasize words in one of those families. And they've been written so that it's not babyish. If as a 4th or 5th grader, I'm having some issues with some of the earlier levels of core vocabulary, it's actually very respectable or respectful of children of different levels to attend to those books at different levels. So if you're needing to intervene for some kids, I'm saying that lower levels aren't babyish texts. It's the same model throughout. Now, what about reading rate? Well, we did a lot of words, and I want a lot of work here, and I want to be clear that I wanted kids to get the idea of what the goal was in terms of oral reading rates. So in each of the books on the level, as I told you, there are 3 books on a level. My aim here isn't to get kids ridiculously fast. I want them to be reading at reasonable rates that are related to meaningful comprehension. So in each of the books, a page has as many words as an average reader, proficient reader, reads at that grade level. So you're actually getting to see what number of words there are. So here at the 5th grade level, what you're seeing is each of the sets of books. Okay, so I'm going to start with book 1 and then move to book 2 and then move to book 3. So this is a passage from book 1. What you see is every book, as you move up in this level, has more words. And as you're seeing, I mean, these are interesting things. And by the way, those little numbers are there so that when you stop, when you're asked to stop reading in a timed reading, and I'm going to emphasize that these timed readings have now moved from oral to silent reading as we've learned more about the challenges that American kids are facing in terms of being proficient readers. You can actually see how far you got. And for some kids, you know, reading that first paragraph is going to be a really big accomplishment. Okay, we can chunk text for kids that haven't done a lot of reading on their own. But we always want things that are engaging to read. And I made sure, you know, I did write all of these, that they were texts that when I saw them for the very last time before they went out for publication, that they were still ideas that intrigued me. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about time. It turns out from the best of the research that we have that we increased the amount of time spent on reading instruction, but didn't increase the amount of time spent reading. You know, as a researcher, nobody's ever done a study like this because I think it's so obvious. But, you know, to get people, I'm going to tell them about gymnastics. And I'm going to give them, you know, little equipment. And we're only going to do it a little bit. I'm being facetious, obviously, and facetious on a webinar often doesn't go over very well. But I wanted to be clear that it is facetious. But what I'm wanting to emphasize, it's not just that we've decreased the amount of reading, but the very best research that we have, this is from Sharon Vaughn's research group, with 7th through 12th graders in English and social studies classes. So in approximately a 55-minute period, they were establishing that the amount of reading was actually a decent amount, but it turned out that even at that level, only 20% of the reading was actually with the students having responsibility for the text. I think we've had a lot of misconceptions about what comprises complex text. And what I've been showing you here today is most texts have 3 words per 100, often in the text that we're using for instruction, many more that are rare. But we can design text that you can actually access. And so what we're seeing here is a lot of kids aren't being responsible for their own reading. And again, that becomes very difficult to get good at something if somebody's always doing the heavy lifting for you. In a study by Melanie Kuhn and her colleagues, Melanie's now at Purdue, and I apologize for not putting her name down there, they found that for second graders, turned out that just an additional 7 minutes a day, and these kids weren't reading, you know, hours and hours in the classroom. They were reading about 12 to 15 minutes to start out with. But in classrooms where there were about 22 minutes of reading a day, you could actually see significant differences on a norm reference test. So what I'm suggesting here is that we increase the amount, I call this responsible reading, when the kids are responsible for the text. And as I mentioned here with these passages, for some kids, responsible reading is going to start with the first paragraph, after which we don't do a comprehension interrogation, but we do a short summary of what's important about the ideas. What is it that I want to remember about these ideas? Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about technique. And in the instructional routine that we used in the research that provided the evidence for QuickReads, we began with silent reading. So you read something silently, you read something along, modeled reading, and then you do a timed reading. Initially, the timed reading was oral, but we've now moved that to silent reading again. And if we need to do 2 modeled readings, then we do that. But there's thinking about what you already know. So we always start out with that question. This is not just about increasing reading speed by any stretch of the imagination. This is about increasing what I know. So, excuse me. We start with the question, think about what you already know, follow along with somebody else, and then read as much of the passage as you can in a minute. And we have opportunities for kids to record the new words they've learned, the new facts they've learned, and what else I'd like to learn about this topic. I think, as well as the semantic map that I showed you earlier, I want kids to have artifacts as they leave a grade of what is it that I've learned. I want them to have artifacts that they can go home and talk about, and they can ask, go to a library and ask for additional books on different kinds of animal communication or different kinds of insects or trees. I live in Northern California, and the whole topic of trees right now is a very one near dear to our heart, as you see some of our state going up in flames. But trees offer so much to us, and there are so many great books about them. Okay, I want to point out that QuickReads from the get-go has had evidence. You'll remember, or you know, that the ESSA requires, evaluates products according to different levels of evidence, with a randomized controlled trial being the highest level. And that, in fact, is what QuickReads has gotten. So it passed the criterion of strong evidence. And if you want to read more about that and the study that was published in the Journal of Research on Educational Effectiveness, which is a very well-regarded archival journal, I think that you should be able to find that by going, you see the URL at the bottom, pearsonschool.com/evidence-based. Okay, and I just wanted to show you, these are some of the studies I wasn't involved in the one that met the criterion for the evidence for ESSA, but in a study that we did with second graders, we actually showed that kids were on a trajectory. You know, if the red X is where the average kids are after a 4-month period of using QuickReads, kids were actually on a trajectory to increase their reading so that they were actually at levels that you would expect for proficient readers. Another study that a graduate student did for a dissertation, Ann Huxley, was the level of gains in knowledge, of content area knowledge. And I think this is quite phenomenal, that kids weren't just gaining an increase in the fluency with which they responded to words. And when you respond with fluency to a word, that means you're capturing the meaning of it, right? You don't recognize a word if you don't recognize what it means. But they were also putting that knowledge together to create meaningful bodies of knowledge. And that's ultimately, that's the area right now. I mean, our kids, as I started out with those data for the oral reading fluency, we've made gains in that, but it's around the knowledge that underlies our English language arts classes that's so critical. I want to tell you about a few extras that you can get. One is that as part of the QuickReads materials, there's a really great assessment, both a pre and a post. And by the way, I've been generating, I don't have them ready to release yet, but we should sometime in this next school year. But I've also been creating, based on the same model, some silent reading maze. That's an assessment where every so often a word is missing. This is the one that you're seeing here is for an oral reading assessment, but I'm working on a silent reading assessment that is connected, is at the same text difficulty as these assessments in silent reading. There's also a teacher's guide with vocabulary acquisition activities, which I think are just so wonderful. And keep remembering these vocabulary acquisition, as you talk about the things that animals do to communicate, you're really talking about your body of knowledge. There are also free resources at Text Project where I've generated additional texts for kids to read in the summer reads. FYI for kids, extending the QuickReads model, and keep remembering that all of these are written in the same way to support the that 2,500 vocabulary in stages, and also in development of background knowledge. Talking points for kids are a set of passages on the same topic. So these are all available for free download at textproject.org. And something I really love is that we have found the key ideas for the vocabulary in all of the QuickReads. We have pictures for those. And you see the URL up there. We have pictures for all the core words, all the words that are going to be rare for kids and that require understanding, that are going to be used throughout their school careers. We've got pictures to support teachers in working with these kids, especially for English language learners. These elements and more extended reading opportunities are going to be so critical. But truly, as I'm sure all of you know, even as adults, we learn words that are concrete more readily than we learn new concepts that are abstract. So these pictures are critical. I welcome you to come to Text Project to use these resources. These resources are under classroom materials. And finally, if you want to learn more about QuickReads and find out where you might be able to get some if you aren't already using them, here's the place. So Tori and Amanda, I don't know, do we have time for some questions? Have people been sending you some questions? That would be my presentation. I'm actually, you know, I made it short because people don't have long periods of time to listen to things. So is anybody out there?
Freddie, this is Amanda. We don't have any questions that came through, but if you are listening now, you can come off mute and feel free to ask Freddie any questions that you may have.
And Amanda, I'm not looking at a place where those questions might pop up. Will you tell me what they are?
I can, yeah. If anyone types any through, I will send them your way.
That would be great. So let's give folks just a couple minutes, about like till about 4 minutes, to see if anyone has some questions.
Sounds great.
And while they're doing that, I'll just summarize. So what I've talked about today are about what I call intentional instruction, that we need to attend to the text. And I'm not suggesting that this intentional text is for all the time, but if you want to have the capacity to read text with a lot of rare words, you need to have a very good foundation with the core vocabulary. That is these 2,500 word families. I've also said that we need to attend, and that these texts were written. These texts aren't simply to increase kids' rates at anything. It's to increase kids' knowledge, and as you recognize words, to understand what the meanings of words are. And then I talked about the fact that we need to attend to the time kids are reading. I think if you were giving kids an additional 7 minutes of reading a day, and it was on some of these kinds of texts that I've shared with you today, like QuickReads or FYI or talking points for kids, those are things that, especially for kids who aren't at the proficient level, are really going to benefit from. And then I talked about having some repeated exposure, but for different reasons. And one of the things I didn't say when I was going through the techniques is every round of experience with a text ends in a comprehension activity. So those comprehension activities that I showed you, the semantic map, the recording on the log of what I've learned, the new words and so on, every iteration through the text, whether it's reading on my own, modeling, or the timed, is always about what is it I'm going to remember, what's important here. So it's not just like, let's run through these texts a couple times. It's read, talk, comprehend, talk about your comprehension. Read, comprehend, and document. So any questions there?
No questions have come through. Quiet group today.
Tori or Amanda, do you have any questions?
I don't have any questions at this time. I think you did a great presentation, and I appreciate your time today.
Okay, so basically what I'm saying is knowledge. It's about knowledge now. That's why we read. It's not just that we technically have the proficiency to read. It's about knowledge. And it's also about having access to knowledge. So for a lot of the kids who need to know stuff, who don't have the background knowledge that it's often assumed in school, often they're the ones who rely on listening. Listening's good, but there are particular kinds of things we learn through text. So if we don't have any more questions, I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us. This is going to be available at Pearson is going to have it available, I assume, Amanda?
Correct.
And it will also be on the on the Text Project website.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Alrighty.
And thanks for giving me this opportunity, Tori and Amanda.